Hello, and welcome to this week's small group as we continue our journey with the Emotionally Healthy Church. Last week we looked at what it means for us to have emotional maturity by learning to live out of our brokenness and vulnerability. Together, we discovered how God desires to use our brokenness and our vulnerability to deepen our relationship with God and with our church, as well as to increase our empathy and compassion for the broken and hurting of our world. When we make the choice to courageously live our lives out of that sense of brokenness and vulnerability, we also become aware of something else within it, and that is our understanding and our experience of limits. This is another one of the more difficult lessons of our journey because we live in a culture that views limits as obstacles to overcome, or as threats to our well-being or to the enjoyment of our lives, or even sometimes as fears that can stop us from trying or cause us to give up when things get hard. Limits are all around us. We have speed limits. Businesses offer us great deals, but only for a limited time. We are also told to push our limits, to consider the limitless possibilities of something. According to our world, limits are the things that get in our way, and the word limit becomes equal to the word less. Have you ever lied about your ability to do something because you didn't want to admit you couldn't? Or have you ever found yourself in a difficult situation because you should have asked for help and you didn't? Or have you ever found yourself doing something you didn't want to do and weren't necessarily passionate about or gifted for, but you still did it because nobody else would, or even because someone else said it was your job? You can probably think of other examples from your own life that also speak to this exhausting, frustrating, and difficult way of being that doesn't allow us to receive the gift of limits. Now, to tell the truth, sometimes we can't avoid it, can we? If something truly has to be done and no one else can do it, then we step in. But then there are other times when instead of receiving the gift of limits, we choose to function out of some internal fear or external pressure, and we miss receiving the gift of limits that can connect us more deeply to ourselves, to others in our relationships, especially the relationship of the church, and also to God who has shaped our lives and called us to God's purposes. So then what does it mean for us to receive the gift of limits? And more than that, why is it something that is important to our own emotional maturity? Well, do you remember the story of the fall of Adam and Eve we read together back in small group number 3? We want to invite you to think about it in relationship to limits. There they are, just the two of them, Adam and Eve, together in a garden paradise with God, along with all of the other creatures of the world living together in peace and harmony. Not to mention all of the abundance and blessings they could never have imagined right at their fingertips. But what does the serpent tempt them with? The one thing God said they could not have. The serpent tempts them with their understanding of limits. And when they fail to recognize the gift of those limits, well, you know how the story turns out for them and for us. But what if they had said, we don't need this tree or its fruit. God has given us limits to keep us connected to God, for us to understand how we are to relate to God, to ourselves, to each other, and to God's world. What if they had received the gift of limits? This is the invitation for us in this week's small group. For those of you who are parents or grandparents, have you ever had the conversation with a child where you told them no, and they responded by saying, "You don't love me. If you loved me, you would let me do it." More often than not, how do we then respond? It's because I love you that I'm not letting you do it. That's what we say, don't we? And that's how God desires us to view the limits within our lives. The gift of limits are not the things we avoid doing out of fear or out of frustration of having to work hard, or the things we choose not to do out of a sense of selfishness because we want things to be a certain way. The gift of limits is the discovery of how God has given each of us and our church a design that has been shaped through our past, through our experiences, through our present positions, through our individual gifts and talents, as well as through God's own purposes for us. Receiving the gift of limits is the ability to intentionally choose to live out of that design, rather than out of our own internal fears or external pressures. In this small group, you're going to have a chance to take a closer look at what might be some of your limits. The workbook tells us limits come in all shapes and sizes. Some are temporary, while others stay with us our entire lives. Some come from the inside, while others come from outside. A limit can be a situation in life, a scar from a painful past, a personality trait, or a physical reality. You will be invited to consider some of the categories of your life, such as personality and temperament, gifts and talents, emotional needs, relational status, where you live, financial resources, education level, spiritual understanding, and others. You will also get to read a story from the life of Jesus, one who lived a life within God's own limits. He didn't always do what everyone else wanted him to do. He didn't even do what he sometimes may have wanted to do himself. He didn't heal everybody he met, and he didn't stay until everybody understood what he was about. Jesus received the gift of limits, because he chose, even unto death on a cross, to live out the very special design that God had for his life, so that he could declare at the end of John's Gospel, "I have brought you glory on earth by completing the work you gave me to do." That is God's call for each of us, isn't it? Receiving the gift of limits is to more fully step into the design God has for our lives, and to begin being faithful in living out of that design. When we are receiving the gift of limits, then we are moving away from living life out of the pressure to become something because other people want us to, or because of some image we have of ourselves and the ways we should be. And instead we are moving closer to living out of God's design. Now it is very important that we all understand that our limits are not always good, or even God intended. We aren't saying that an abusive past, or a terminal illness, or financial hardship is a good thing, or that God even caused it to limit you. Instead, it is to be able to be honest and to reflect honestly on the very real presence of limits in our lives, and within them to discover the gifts that connect us more deeply to ourselves and above all to God. To be the emotionally healthy church is to recognize how God designs and redesigns our lives using the good, the bad, and the ugly, and how within our limits we can find the gift of peace to be who we truly are as the beloved children of God, as well as the gift of purpose to live out of our limits in ways that more deeply connect us to ourselves, to one another, and mutual support as the body of Christ, and above all to God, who limited God's very self for us. Blessings to you and to your small group.